The last few weeks we've been operating on a premise that is at the heart of the gospel. This premise is that what makes life with Jesus different from every other worldview or philosophy operating in the world today, this difference is between religion and experiencing God in your life. The premise, straight from the Bible, is grace is greater than everything. The primary verse that we've been operating on is Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble to defile many. Now, I don't know what you would put in the blank of grace is greater than, but grace is greater than your greatest sins. Grace is greater than your worst regrets. Grace is greater than your darkest secrets. Grace is more powerful than your hidden shame. Grace is greater than anything. So today we want to see that grace is greater than your most gut-wrenching hurts. Now, we all have hurts. We've all been hurt. Some people like to give you the impression that they're coated with Teflon, that nothing seems to stick to them. They put on this brave front that whatever painful thing happened in the past, it didn't faze them and they've gotten beyond it. Yet when you look at how they're making out in life, what they do to cope and the relational wreckage along the way, you can see that we're talking about more than just a few bumps and bruises going on. There's a wound inside that is so gaping that they're in danger of missing the grace of God. There's a bitter root growing down there that's causing a lot of trouble and is defiling many relationships. There's a difference between someone explaining grace to you, like I'm doing here today, and you experiencing it. Until you experience grace personally, you really don't know what I'm talking about. A Pharisee who thought he knew about grace was outraged that a woman of disrepute anointed Jesus and wiped his feet with her tears. He had this conversation going on inside of him, Luke 7:39. He said, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner. And so after telling Simon, this Pharisee, a parable, Jesus says to him, I tell you, her many sins are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has forgiven little, loves little. This woman received much grace, and the outcome was she expressed to Jesus much grace, great grace. It changes the way she worships. She's not like the Pharisee who just sort of keeps Jesus at an emotional distance. She's shedding tears and wiping feet out of pure love and adoration for him. She doesn't care what other people think. She's so grateful for what Jesus has done for her. Once you experience God's grace, it changes you to the core of who you are. It changes how you worship and live. Grace makes all the difference. And that's what we celebrate as a church. It's what sets us apart from everybody else. You get grace and you find yourself giving grace. So today we're going to flip the grace coin over and talk about messy grace. When you're on the receiving end of grace, that's all good. You know, we love that. But what happens when you're the one who needs to give grace? Grace can be messy and hard when you're talking about a parent who berated you, a spouse who betrayed you, a boss who fired you, the person who stabbed you in the back, that relative who abused you, that father who abandoned you, a friend who rejected you, that teacher who ridiculed and embarrassed you in front of everybody. Grace is a fine idea when it's coming your way, but a lot messier when you need to give it to somebody who's put a hole in your heart. Proverbs 14:10 says, every heart knows its own bitterness, As I've said, we've all been hurt. We all carry around some hurt somewhere. And you still may be carrying it. How can you tell? Well, you can see it at whether your forgiveness is real or whether you're still holding on to your hurts. You might even see it in how you relate to God, whether you're able to worship and abandon yourself to Him. We all have certain emotional experiences that we try to keep locked up in the closet of our hearts. There may be a lot of stored in there that needs to be cleaned out. Ephesians 4:31 says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice." You know, whatever's in your closet that's keeping you from experiencing grace and giving grace, the Bible says you need to get rid of that. Of course, you're going to need God's help to do that. You wish it was easy, but it's not. It's easier to keep the closet door shut and pretend that everything's just fine. But I'm not going to give you an easy button today. There's no magic grace button. Giving grace is messy. It will hurt. It will cost you something. But it will do something else. Randy Frazee remembers seeing a picture of a husband and wife in a man's office. He turned around and he said, "Nice picture." And then when he saw the man's eyes, who was with him in the room, he saw there were tears in his eyes. And so he asked him, "Why are you crying?" This man went on to say, "This was a time of my marriage, this picture, when I was unfaithful to my wife and she found out. She was so deeply hurt that she was going to leave me and take the kids with her. I was so overwhelmed with what I'd done, and I shut the affair down. I went to my wife in total brokenness, knowing that I did not deserve it, and she forgave me." He says this picture is taken about that time. When I see this picture, I see a woman who forgave me. I see a woman who is willing to stand with me in this picture. So when you see this picture and say, "Nice picture," I see the picture and I see that my life was given back to me. That's what grace does. It gives people their life back. And if you're the one giving grace, it gives you life back too. When grace flows through you, it flows out of you, and that's really grace sort of flowing back to you. Real life doesn't happen without grace. That's what Peter finds out when he comes to Jesus with a question in Matthew 18:21. He says, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" In Jesus' answer, he's going to tell a story called the parable of the unmerciful servant. What Jesus teaches us in this parable is that grace is only grace if it goes both ways. If all you do is receive grace from others, but then you refuse to give grace to others, that means you really don't understand grace. That means you really don't understand the gospel. The extent you're willing to give others grace reveals the extent to which you have received His grace. The litmus test for the reality of the gospel in your life is the extent to which you give grace and forgiveness to the person who has hurt you the most. How far are you willing to go to give grace to the person who has hurt you and maybe in your mind deserves it the least? And so Peter asks, is 7 times enough? Is there a limit to how much grace I've got to give? Now, in his day, there was a social rule that you only had to forgive somebody 3 times, and that was enough. No more mercy, no more grace. You didn't have to forgive them. Peter thinks of somebody who's hurt him 7 times, and he's had enough. He's gone as far with this person as he wants to go. He's done with them, and he thinks, 7 times, I'm off the hook. Well, maybe for you it's not the number of times somebody's hurt you, but the intensity of the hurt. What you experienced was 7 times the pain. You hurt to the 7th power. maybe to the 77th power. Jesus, when has hurt become greater than grace, you might ask? When does grace for somebody run out? When am I done having to give grace? Usually it's the people we are closest to who hurt us the most. When we give them our hearts, we give them power over us. They hurt us deeply at times, and it causes damage. So we pull back. We refuse to let people into our hearts. Someone you loved and trusted hurt you, betrayed you, and so you're never going to let anybody have that kind of power over you again. And so Peter wants to know, when does grace run out? Well, Jesus says in verse 22, Matthew 18:22, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, we don't want to get lost in the numbers here. Jesus' answer is essentially, grace is never less than whatever happened to you. Grace is always greater than whatever hurt you faced. Greater than a broken heart? Yes. Greater than a betrayed heart? Yes. Grace for that unfair thing done to you? Absolutely. Greater than my pain? Of course. Grace is always greater. Please understand that grace does not justify abuse, and grace also has boundaries. Grace always does the loving thing, and that sometimes means putting boundaries in place and speaking the truth in love. Be careful, because we can always come up with exceptions, that my grace only has to go this far. I've done it 7 times, that's enough. Well, for almost 18 years, Kevin Tunnell was required to mail $1 a week to a person that he wanted to forget. Now, he was sued for $1.5 million, but the family settled for $936 to be paid $1 a week until it was paid off. You see, Kevin was convicted of manslaughter for driving drunk and killing this family's 18-year-old daughter. The family was not really interested in money, but penance. My question is 936 payments enough? When they receive the final payment, will they finally have peace? Will 18 years of restitution be enough? Will 216 months of remorse be adequate? If Kevin Tunnell had caused you that kind of pain, how many payments would you require? Better yet, how many payments are you requiring of somebody? What hurt is greater, it seems anyhow, than God's grace in your life? Jesus tells a story to help us emotionally get ourselves wrapped around this truth that grace is greater than any hurt. And so he begins here, chapter 18, verse 23, after Peter's asked about the 7 times. He says, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. This guy owed the equivalent of $150 million. Now, this is several times the national budget for that particular time. He's in way over his head. Anybody who heard about a guy owing $150 million would have laughed his head off, because Jesus was using hyperbole here. He was exaggerating, because a servant could never actually owe that much money. The picture Jesus is painting is a debt that can never be repaid. And so he goes on, he says, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. And so the master is going to cut his losses. Sin has racked up a debt that you and I could never repay. You can't work your way out of it. No amount of good deeds could ever offset anything that we've done against God. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You know, that's all of us. We owe a debt that we can never begin to repay. It's way short, so far short that we can't make up the difference. You and I will never be able to make up for how we have failed God. You don't have enough time, you don't have enough resources, you don't have a great enough will to do it in your own power. And so the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. He's desperate. He's making a promise that he can't even begin to keep. He's powerless to do anything about his situation. There's nothing he will ever be able to do that will cover the cost of what he owes. That's when we come to the good news of the gospel. Verse 26, the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. His master doesn't extend his credit. He doesn't lower the payments. He cancels it. That means he forgives it. It's forgiven, forgotten. The man is set free from his burden. Now this turn of events is mind-boggling. What happens next is even more mind-boggling. It goes on here in Matthew 18. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. Now, if you had never heard this story before, you would be thinking, well, of course he's going to forgive him. You know, after all the grace he's received, you know, he owed $1.5 million, and, you know, he was forgiven, so surely he's going to forgive this fellow servant because he owes a measly $20. I mean, what's that compared to $1.5 million? But that's not what happens. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me. He went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. So he refuses to give $20 worth of forgiveness. He fails to show how small the man's debt is compared to what he owed. As Pastor Jean Leroux says, if the biggest sinner you don't know isn't you, then you don't know yourself very well. When you fail to give grace, you don't know yourself. In fact, it shows you don't know God as well as you say you do. Now there's more to this unwillingness to forgive than you know. Back then, when you had somebody thrown into prison, well, the state didn't cover the cost. Who did? You did. So rather than forgive this guy $20, he pays to have the man thrown into prison. He ends up paying far more than what was owed to him. You see, the sin of unforgiveness is costly. That's how unforgiveness still works. When you refuse to forgive and you keep the other person locked up in the prison of your bitterness, guess who's really paying for that? You are. You're the one who's always angry. You're the one who's constantly stressed. You're the one whose stomach is tied up in knots. You're the person who's losing sleep. You might have her locked up in that prison of your mind, but your life's the one that's a mess. Then there's something else we don't expect in this parable. Verse 31. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. The fellow servants saw how much this man had been forgiven and that he refused to forgive someone else, and they were outraged by that. They all live together in this community where the master doesn't treat you as servants, but like his sons and daughters. The church is like that. It's a community where overwhelming grace flows all the time, in all directions. So when one of their own receives this kind of grace and refuses to give it, this is a big problem. When we see someone in our spiritual community has received the undeserved grace of the master, but then refuses to give grace to a fellow servant, it's a big problem. And we should be outraged. We should be very distressed. We should not let it go. We need to take it to the master. We need to speak the truth in love. There needs to be a determination that in this community of God's people, we're going to have the Master's heart. We're going to reflect His grace. We're going to forgive. We're not going to hold grudges. Grace is the main thing that should stand out about us as God's people. It's what sets us apart as sons and daughters of God, brothers and sisters of Jesus. You can't speak the truth in love if you can't show grace to people and how you treat them. When there are people among us in the faith who don't live grace-giving lives, it should shock us. It should grieve us, and we should address it. When the truth is not being spoken in love, we need to graciously speak the truth in love. Not arrogantly, humbly. Jesus said it's not okay for us to celebrate the grace He's given us and then refuse to give it back to others. In fact, He says, "For if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their sins, your Father will not forgive you your sins." Now that's pretty drastic, isn't it? You might say, but what about what this person over here did to me? They abandoned me. They abused me, they had an affair on me, they attacked me. You know, they owe me a childhood. They owe me a marriage. They owe me money. They at least owe me an explanation. No matter what somebody else owes you, if you've received from God grace, that's what you need to give to others. Grace. Jesus doesn't what Jesus gives us doesn't run out on us. Jesus answers Peter's equation with one of His own. The millions is far greater than the 20 bucks. In other words, God's forgiveness of you is far greater than any forgiveness you might need to give to anybody else. Now, this is not to make light of what needs to be forgiven. What it says is, the more you understand the holiness of God, and the more you understand yourself, the more this makes sense to you. If this equation doesn't make sense, then you really don't understand the gospel. You really don't know yourself. You've not truly embraced the grace of God. There are consequences when you fail to embrace grace and release grace. And so this is how the parable begins to come to an end. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?" In anger, the master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Jesus is not vague about what happens when grace doesn't grip your life. Your own soul is the one that is tortured. Your life is the one in prison. You've locked yourself off from a life full of grace and freed by grace. You'll never escape this condition by yourself. What is it called when you refuse to give grace? Well, we might call it hell. Hell is not just a place in eternity. Hell is a life lived without grace. And so, as Paul says in Colossians 3:13, we are to forgive as the Lord forgave you. You're never more like God than when you forgive, especially when you forgive those who in your mind least deserve it. You're never less like God than when you refuse to forgive. Learning to forgive is what it really means to grow up spiritually and to look like Jesus. An unwillingness to forgive means you're more spiritually immature than you think you are. Many people are living in denial of their refusal to forgive. Denial will keep you locked away from the grace of God that you need to set you free. Kyle Idleman tells a story not from a woman who was betrayed, but from one who did the betraying. Here's her story. She says, "I grew up in the church. I knew what was expected of me as a moral person and as a follower of Christ. I met Bill at the park, and our relationship quickly went from friendship to so much more. Our selfish desires were more detrimental to him being married. We made attempts to be honorable and end it, but selfishness prevailed. Then our secret became tangible. I was pregnant. A pregnancy test in my hand convicted me of my sin. I did love him, but I offered to leave the area and not disrupt his life further. I felt more culpable in our situation because I had knowingly disregarded God's voice. He made the decision to reveal the betrayal to his wife and ask for a divorce. They had been together for 8 years with no children. It turns out Bill's wife was named Lisa. So imagine how devastated Lisa would have been to find that her husband is cheating on her, that another woman is having his baby, and on top of that, he wants a divorce. If anybody should be full of resentment instead of grace, it would be Lisa. But the betrayer continues her story. She says, when Bill told Lisa of our relationship, of the pregnancy, and essentially the end of her life as she knew it, she was undoubtedly devastated. Do you know what she did after she watched her life come crumbling down around her? She called me, the betrayer, to say that she didn't hate me, and that while she would surely go through some tough times in the future, after all was said and done, her prayer was that somehow we could all still be a family. She later asked me if she could be Aunt Lisa to the baby. I couldn't comprehend it. All these years later, I still can't. How? Who has such strength? Who has such grace? Well, we certainly deserve the wrath of a woman who never deserved such treatment. After our son was born, there was a friendship and true love that flowed without reserve. Bill didn't know Jesus. He still doesn't. But Lisa and I began to pray together for him. We prayed that he would come to see the love and grace of Jesus through everything that happened. Her grace humbles me daily. There are no words for her forgiveness. I guess the only word is Jesus. Her strength, her mercy, her grace are a mere inkling of what Jesus offers. And so, Jesus concluded the parable by saying, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from the heart. No one has that kind of strength. No one has that much grace. That grace came from Jesus to Lisa, and she let it flow through her life. Grace flows from you. If it doesn't, you've missed the grace of God, and you're not living in His power. What you inhale is what you exhale. If you're inhaling God's forgiveness and grace, that's what you will exhale from your life. Is grace flowing out of you today towards everybody, especially the people who've hurt you the most? Oh God, today may we fully receive your love, your forgiveness, your grace, so that in turn, may that same love, forgiveness, and grace flow through us to others. We know it can't happen unless it's by your power.